Hi, I'm Karen Trout, Community Engagement Librarian at Kalamazoo Public Library, and this is a re-recording of a program that was presented on October 21st, 2020, and I'm happy to welcome back Ruth Garcia and Molly Mechtenberg, who will be speaking on the school to prison pipeline. So I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Karen. Thanks for having us, and we're happy to be sharing this information again. So just a quick introduction. My name is Molly Mechtenberg. I work with Gryphon Place, and I've been working primarily in schools for the past 6 years, doing restorative justice work, conflict resolution, and it's been a great experience to be in many different area schools, high schools, middle schools, elementary, doing this work, and have moved into more of a training capacity in the past couple of years. So I've been able to kind of share not only our work, but the philosophy and the practices behind it to workplaces and teachers in the area. I'm gonna let Ruth introduce herself.
And I'm Ruth Garcia. I am the Restorative Practices Community Liaison currently for Gryphon Place. Formerly, I was overseeing the restorative justice programming in schools. I came to be at Gryphon Place through the suicide prevention work that Gryphon Place offers after having lost a couple of loved ones to suicide, and then started studying the way that substance abuse is treated and criminalized in our country and a lot of the disparities that occur with that. That actually led to a lot of an increased interest in social justice work, which is a part of the reason that I got involved with restorative justice, as well as being passionate about working with youth, having my own kids, and a lot of other reasons as well. So today we are going to talk about a social theory, if you will, a phenomenon that we see that is occurring in schools in our nation. And this is called the school to prison pipeline. Our objectives today are to, of course, review what that means, define that, explore that, and talk about the factors that contribute to this. We'll review the historical roots and the impact of zero tolerance policies, so how it got to be to the place that it is. Like many things, there were plenty of good intentions abroad when that historical roots had occurred. We'll look at the role of officers in schools, and we'll also touch on some functional knowledge regarding teenage mental health and trauma and just the way the brain at that age works, and discuss the work that Molly and I do, which is restorative practices, as well as a way to move forward. At the end, we are hoping to compile some of the Q&A sessions that we had from our original session. As always, please feel free to reach out to Molly and I if you have additional questions as well. So school to prison pipeline, this is basically a process in which a school has policies, practices, disciplinary typically, that directly or indirectly push a school out of the school system into the juvenile justice system, and unfortunately on a pathway to prison. So what this might look like, as early as preschool even, or elementary, a student starts getting, maybe having some behavioral problems in the classroom and is removed from their preschool environment even, or asked to go out to the hallway repeatedly, missing their academic time. As a school, as a child gets older in the school, this might take the form of then being pushed out through suspensions. This might start from a day to 5 to 10, resulting in that student losing credit for their classes, potentially dropping out. We'll talk about what those statistics look like, but there is definitely an increased risk for dropping out. And then once the student has reached that point, there is not a lot of options left. So we do see an increased risk for heading on that pathway to prison.
And another term that we are going to be referring to that we just need to get familiar with at the beginning of our presentation is this idea of zero tolerance. So zero tolerance policies are referring to school discipline policies that mandate really harsh punitive punishments for both minor and major infractions, right? So originally it was intended for kind of major infractions of bringing a weapon to school, but over time that expanded and it became it became policy that schools then would operate under. So whenever there was misbehavior, there would be some kind of exclusionary punishment, right? So suspension, or like Ruth said, sitting out in the hallway, missing class, detention. So these exclusionary punishments are referred to as zero tolerance, right? When there's no tolerance for any kind of misbehavior and kids are then pushed out. So this policy really started to take off in the 1980s and continued into the 2000s. And really, to fully understand it, it's important to kind of look at the history behind zero tolerance. So let's jump back to 1969. President Nixon declared this war on drugs, right? So the war on drugs really opened up a whole new era in policing and in our criminal justice system. Policies that weren't standard practice previously became like just part of how things were done in our country. It became increasingly punitive. So these practices such as mandatory minimums, these stop and frisk policies, really harsh sentencing for low-level drug crimes that were typically nonviolent crimes, right? It really accelerated the rate of incarceration in our country. And Ruth, go ahead to the next slide. You can see that this rate of incarceration dramatically impacted the Black community. They were incarcerated at rates over 2 times that of the white population. So this really, it increased for everyone, but it especially, skyrocketed for the Black community during this time. And the impact that this had on families, I know that this isn't part of our presentation, but when somebody is put into the criminal justice system, is incarcerated, that it has a devastating effect on families, right? Just through losing a caregiver, losing an income source, all kinds of ways that will then impact families. So what was happening in the country, this war on drugs policy and this idea that we need to get tough on crime, what happened was this expanded to schools. And all of a sudden there were kind of all these new policies in schools and this increasingly push for more punitive discipline and pushing out of kids, suspension. And so all of this started to happen. There started to be metal detectors started to appear in schools. Police officers started to appear in schools. And so what was happening nationally this trend also started in the schools, even though if you look at the data, there wasn't a huge rise in crime in schools during this time. That has remained pretty consistent over the years. These policies just kind of got increasingly punitive despite the data that showed that things were pretty much staying the same. So a major thing that happened was in 1994, Bill Clinton, he passed this huge crime bill, and as part of that was this Gun-Free Schools Act. So what this did was it imposed this federal requirement on school districts. So there was federal money attached to this. They had to adopt the zero tolerance policy for weapons, for guns. So initially that was the intention. They said, we don't want guns in schools. Well, we can all agree that that's a good, we don't want guns in schools, right? We understand the danger and how we can't allow that to happen. Well, so the original intention was possibly had a good meaning, but what happened was over time, zero tolerance expanded, and they started to use it for all kinds of different things. Like even just this idea of a gun, they brought in the language and it became weapons. And then when you're talking about weapons, you can talk about everything from somebody accidentally leaving a butter knife in their lunchbox and accidentally bringing that to school, then that could be considered a weapon, and that student could actually be expelled from school for that. These aren't just like imaginary stories. These things actually did happen. Students would, younger kids would have like a toy gun in their backpack. They could be suspended or expelled for long periods of time for something like that. having a pocket knife and, that left over from a weekend camping trip. So all of these things, even just expanding this idea of weapons, became a point, where kids were being pushed out of schools. And then even beyond that, suspensions were happening for other misbehavior, for arguing in the hallway, or for getting into a scuffle in the cafeteria, for talking back to a teacher, right? So zero tolerance just started to become the way that schools operated. Now, of course, I want to talk about Columbine really quick. In 1999, this idea of zero tolerance for weapons, and just in general, zero tolerance, really, the Columbine school shooting tragically happened, and that kind of reinforced this concept. And after that, there was also a lot more money that was poured into bringing the police officers into schools. So what happened, and we can see the data here, very similar to what happened in our country, in that suspension rates and expulsion rates skyrocketed. And this was especially the case for the Black community and the Latino community. So you can see this graph shows from the early 70s through 2010, 2009, 2010. And you can see that for Black students, it more than doubled, the rate of suspension more than doubled during this time. And very similar for the Latino students. So a very similar thing was happening in schools that was happening in our country.
Now, notice on the last slide that data was taken from 2009, 2010. So slightly more recent data suggests that some of that disparity or disproportionate suspension of Latinx students has leveled off a bit. The rates for Black high school students are unfortunately still twice as likely compared to like their white counterpart students. Student with disability is also twice as likely to be suspended than those without a disability, despite most students with a disability having an IEP or a individual education plan for school. There's still an increased level of suspension. So one positive, because we do want to tell as complete of a story as possible, Molly and I are here to talk about our experiences, but also talk about really well-documented data and information. So on a positive note, NPR suggests that suspension rates have actually lowered a bit. This could be due to just overall less suspensions. It could also be due to less frequent but longer suspensions or informal suspensions, such as having a student be picked up from school, but not necessarily formally suspending them either. So this next slide is a little dense, so I apologize for that. However, again, Molly and I felt it important to not just bring our own experience in, not just bring the experience and narratives of others who have studied this, who have done this, but bring in some pretty sound and evidence-based research. So we wanted to look at different research studies and talk about the different things that we saw when we reviewed this. So there was a study, for example, done on Chicago students. When they had come in contact with the legal system, they were 6 to 8 times more likely to drop out. We'll talk about trauma real briefly in this webinar, and Molly had mentioned how hard, for example, it can be on a student, a family unit, extended family, when someone is incarcerated. If we look at the ACEs score, our adverse childhood experience, this qualifies as a trauma. So thinking about coming in contact with yourself, a law enforcement or legal system, this does have that, at least in this study, showed that there was a statistical relationship there between an increased likelihood of dropping out. A meta-analysis done, they looked at 34 different studies, and there was an inverse relationship. So when one went up, the other went down between suspension and positive student outcomes being defined like staying on track with your peers and graduating on time, passing standardized testing, passing grades. So inverse relationship, the more they were suspended, the less likely they were to have positive outcomes. There was a direct relationship, this meta-analysis found, between out-of-school suspensions, that's what the OSS stands for, and dropping out. So the more they were out of school, the more likely they were to drop out. Schools overall with lower out-of-school suspensions, just across the spectrum, report higher testing outcomes. Of course, there is other variables in there, right? But this speaks to this narrative that Molly and I frequently hear in this work, which is that why should the other 26 students suffer while one student is this quote unquote bad apple? Well, if we look at the data, this actually impacts the school as a whole. If the school as a whole has a practice to remove students to push them out, then the result is the school as a whole tends to do more poorly. So the reason that this starts to progress, and the reason that we see this process from the school to where we say the school to prison pipeline, is that as a young person drops out, that risk for being arrested dramatically increases. So we're talking about a 3.5 times jump that they're going to be arrested. In addition to that, you're looking at an individual who is now at increased risk for substance abuse problems, for making lower wages, for higher unemployment, and increased use of governmental aid. So there's a financial component to this as well. If we look nationally at data, about 68%, taken in 2014 anyway, of all males in prison do not have a high school diploma. So this reflects that on the flip side as well. So we're looking at the prison population, we can reflect back on that high school education was never achieved for at least 2/3 of them. Again, speaking to the fiscal component of this, we're looking at about $30,000 per inmate annually. And this accounts to be billions annually in taxes. Now, we could spend a whole lot of time talking about the prison system as a whole and the disproportionalities that exist there, and they do exist there as well. But as a person, if you go into the incarceration system, you lose a great deal of your rights, losing the access to receive federal aid to go back to school, to make more than the $8,000 a year you're projected to make as a high school dropout, for example, losing housing options and voting rights, but you're also going to continue to pay a fee. You have your lifetime to pay it off, right? But if people incarcerated are paying to be incarcerated, and we as taxpayers are paying for them to be incarcerated, who is being paid by this? And again, we could speak to that much longer than we have time for to give. But I wanted to end, we're speaking a lot now to the stats and the data, but I wanted to end this portion before we move on and talk about an experience I had for a local diplomacy group in Kalamazoo called Colleagues International. They had a group of visitors from Uzbekistan. I had never heard of Uzbekistan. This is a country located near Afghanistan and Kazakhstan in the Middle East. And I'm explaining to them the work that we do, where sometimes we're able to work with schools, reduce suspension time, reduce the out of school time, if the students are willing to engage in restorative conference or restorative peace circle. And they're following the latter portion of this, but a group of them are getting hung up on what I mean by exclusionary policies, removing kids from school. And finally, one of the men there asked me, if the student is removed from their learning environment, who goes to their house to help them stay up with their homework? And I answered him, no one, because our system is not necessarily set up to help people get back on track. We are set up to say, once you're off the track, then, well, you should have known better. Now this next slide, this whole presentation, Molly and I were really intentional to want to talk about this anywhere that we go is not a call out. This is a call in. So when looking at this data, these are the schools in Kalamazoo and Van Buren County that have disproportionate rates of one or more out of school suspensions. So schools where brown or black students are disproportionately suspended at higher rates. If you pull up a list of Kalamazoo and Van Buren County schools, this is most of them. So again, this is not to pinpoint any one school in particular. This is rather to open up a dialogue. There's also, and I say this with all the love because I am from Kalamazoo, there's also this tendency to talk about Kalamazoo in a way that these social problems might not occur here, that because we have certain ideals that we are above or not impacted by certain social and systemic racist problems. But this is occurring here. So this phenomenon is not just Chicago's issue. This is not New York's issue. And it is still, but we have to address this in our city as well here. This data got a bit jumbled here as we converted things. So we're happy to send out any PowerPoint information that you want. Hopefully you can still follow along there with this. But this is a look at the different, in Kalamazoo County, the amount of time that was lost per each school year.
So increasingly, the data was showing that there was a problem with our zero tolerance policies. The data was showing that we were disproportionately suspending Black and Brown students. So in 2014, in fact, the Federal Department of Education and Justice issued a letter to state education commissioners warning that districts continuing to have a pattern of disproportional discipline risk federal civil rights action. So they kind of came down and said, you know what, we've been looking at the data, this is not okay, right? The Department of Education. And right around that same time, there's some of these kind of big names in the education world started to make statements and show that they had also looked at this data and they were reversing what they previously had supported. So this is a quote from Randy Weingarten, who is the president of the American Federation of Teachers. She said, "These policies were promoted by people, including me, who had hoped they would standardize discipline procedures and free students from the disruptions of misbehaving peers. It was analogous to the broken windows theory of policing. We were wrong. Data have shown both that these policies have failed to make students safer and their discriminatory application violates the 1964 Civil Rights Act. Zero tolerance policies intended to maintain safety and order not only have failed to do so, but have caused considerable harm." So this is a huge reversal. And let's go to the next slide. You'll also see this is from Eric Holder, who was Attorney General under the Obama administration, also from 2014. "Too often, so-called zero tolerance policies, however well-intentioned, make students feel unwelcome in their own schools. They disrupt the learning process, and they can have significant and lasting negative effects on the long-term well-being of our young people, increasing their likelihood of future contact with juvenile and criminal justice systems." So this is really significant that these kind of big names were coming out and saying, we were wrong, right? And not only we were wrong, but now we have to undo this system that's in place that has been discriminatory towards Black and Brown students, right? So it's kind of a huge task ahead. There was just this recognition at the time that, schools were meant to be places where learning happened, where students felt safe and supported. And there was a huge population of kids who were getting left behind, like literally pushed out of school and left behind, right? And so, like Ruth said, this is a problem in our city. It's a problem in rural areas. It's a problem across our whole country. This was happening. This is a nationwide issue. The data is fascinating to look at because you'll see these trends happening in every school across the country generally. And it kind of brings to mind this idea that if we want to close this achievement gap, right, we want to have all kids succeed in school, then we need to close this disciplinary gap. And I want to say, like, as a parent of KPS students, Kalamazoo Public School students, and grateful for the Kalamazoo Promise, this feels especially true in Kalamazoo because we need students to graduate from high school, and in order to be able to take advantage of this huge gift of the Kalamazoo Promise. So we need to close that disciplinary gap.
So in a state level, I've seen some things occur too. And just to, preface this beforehand to say that what all of what Molly is saying, this transition, it is really powerful because it is it's human to try new things, and it is in some ways human to fail at them. But what we have seen is a failure of these policies to in fact make schools safer, and in fact they have failed at that and caused more harm. And to be clear, while this does disproportionately affect students of color, this is harmful to all students of all backgrounds, of all races, right? So this push out practice is harmful to all. So on a state level, Michigan in 2016 passed the Restorative Justice Law. This asks students to look at alternatives, namely restorative justice, recommending restorative justice, in fact, as a viable solution to deterring future misconduct and as an alternative to pushing students out. This was basically seeking to eliminate the zero tolerance, discipline across the state. Something else that's important to know as we look at data, as we look at different trends, we can't take a group of students like we would lab mice and introduce a variable and then see what happens and come up with these really concrete A plus B equals C equation. It's not ethical to do that. We can't take two groups of students and provide one with an education and restorative practices instead of punitive discipline, and then do the exact opposite with the other ones, just for the sake of experimentation, right? But what we can do is look at things that are already occurring, track those outcomes, and extrapolate what is happening from that. Just like it is unethical to take two groups of students and intentionally introduce variables, in my opinion, is similar to continue doing a practice that we know in fact does not make schools safer and in fact does cause harm. It lacks some ethics. So we're going to transition and talk about the role of officers in schools. This was along the same lines of making schools safer. So Kalamazoo, for example, there's one in Kalamazoo Central and Moy Norks. Their focus, as we're being told, is to promote relationships in school. We are hoping to get some data from our police in this area, but just know that the data we'll talk about community schools in this presentation does focus on a national level.
So considering, this phenomena, there have been increasing money and a push to get police officers in schools. There are several points here to consider. So the first one, one of the big reasons, that is given to get police officers in schools is for safety, right? And of course, this is highlighted every single time there's a school shooting. There's this big push to add more police officers. If you look at the data, though, it does show that the number of students who actually are killed at school each year, right? I mean, and any number is not okay, but the number has remained very consistent over the years. So that number hasn't gone either up or down. It hasn't dropped as we've added more police officers. That number has remained consistent through the 1970s until now. It occasionally does still happen. It is extremely rare even now, right? That's my first point. My second point is it's important to think about. So what sometimes happens when we have officers in schools is kind of student behavior or misbehavior becomes criminalized, right? So we all know that teenagers sometimes make bad decisions. We're going to talk about this in a little bit, just how their brains are not done developing yet. They act impulsively. They don't think about consequences. There's a lot of real scientific information that can help us understand why teenagers act the way that they do. And by no means do we ever want to just let them off the hook and say, oh, that's okay. But at the same time, it's risky when we start criminalizing normal teenage behavior, right? So students get arrested at school for things like disrupting school and disorderly conduct and assault. So like a fight in the hallway, right? Typically those students obviously need to get separated and they need to, you know, deal with their principal or vice principal. But in some schools, those students are arrested and they're put into the juvenile justice system, right? Where then they have a record, and that has a dramatic impact on the rest of their life. And furthermore, if you kind of look at some of these reasons why students are arrested, it feels like it's not being used properly, right? There might be a time and a place where there is a circumstance where a student needs to be dealt with by a police officer. But there are incidences of someone throwing a paper airplane and getting charged with assault, throwing a baby carrot at lunch, arguing with a police officer, kicking a trash can, cursing, taking an extra milk at lunch, buying lunch with a fake $2 bill. These are all documented reasons why students have been arrested in school. So there's a lot of gray area there, and so that's why it's risky to kind of allow this criminalization of student behavior to even happen. The third point I want to make is that the American Civil Liberties Union has done a lot of work on this. They believe that this data isn't even accurate because underreporting is a really huge issue. Schools are not being super forthcoming with this data. They're not always sharing, if they have an officer, how often that arrest is happening, why that arrest is happening. So you have to work pretty hard to get that information. The ACLU reported that New York City public schools reported 0 arrests in 2015, 2016, and yet the New York Police Department had separately tracked this, and they had reported 952 arrests in schools. So there's obviously some underreporting going on, and it's hard to kind of paint an accurate picture when there's underreporting going on. I want to just highlight that last point there. In Michigan, Black girls were 8 times more likely to be arrested. This was one of the highest disparities in the entire country. And I would highly recommend a book. It's not specifically about Michigan, but it's a book that looks more closely at this issue. The book is called Push Out, and it's been made into a film that's kind of circulating around the country right now. So if you're interested in that topic specifically, I would recommend checking out that book. And one last point I want to make is that every time there's a school shooting, right, there's a lot of conversation about what needs to happen, and there's a lot of then federal money that's pushed into getting more police officers in schools. Well, typically what has happened is while these school shootings have happened in suburban or in rural districts, the money is funneled into the cities. It's funneled into these urban schools, and so Black and brown students are a lot more likely to have an officer in school than white students.
Which is in part why you see some of the same disparities that we noted in the criminal justice system and suspensions with who is getting arrested in schools. So this idea that officers just being present in the school can lead to an increased risk for getting arrested. Right now, again, I do want to emphasize that this is national data, and the local branches within our area do assert that that is not their primary focus. So you'll see, for example, this top line, who gets arrested, Black students, 33%, while their overall enrollment is at 15%. So it's almost double there of what you would anticipate. It's that disproportionality and inherent subjectivity too, with who is viewed as dangerous and who is not. This is another slide that represents, and I like this one because it also pulls in that disparity of students with disabilities. So a student who may not cognitively or physically appear or act in the same way as their peers that do not have a disability are also at that increased risk.
All right, so we're going to talk briefly about these policies that are written up between a school and the law enforcement agency. So these are called either an MOU, Memorandum of Understanding, or an IGA, which is an intergovernmental agreement. These are kind of these formal policies that explain and define the role and responsibilities of police officers in school. So during the 2017-18 school year, 2/3 of schools who had a police officer had one of these policies, right? So that 2/3 number seems good, but then when you think that 1/3 of schools who had a police officer didn't even have a policy, right? They had no way to explain or define the role of that officer. That's a pretty big number. 1/3 of schools didn't even have one of these. So let's take a closer look at these MOUs or IGAs and what they offer. So if we look at U.S. public schools who have an officer present, the ones that do have a formalized policy or written document, right? This graph kind of looks at these certain topics and whether that policy covers that topic. So the topic over on the left, the first one, student discipline, 55% of schools reported that their policy had language covering this topic. 12% did not have language covering this topic, and 33% didn't know whether they had language covering this topic. So that's a pretty huge one, because that's when we're talking about whether police officers can intervene in typical student discipline in a school, right? This is where there's kind of a lot of subjective decisions that are made, like what is considered criminal behavior and what isn't, or what is a misbehavior deemed worthy of arrest or feels appropriate for arrest and what isn't. So that's a pretty big one. The use of physical or chemical restraints. If you add those last two numbers, 56% of schools either didn't have any language in there, or they weren't aware of what that language was. Use of firearms, that goes up even more. Making arrests on school grounds, whether that is allowed or not. And finally, reporting of criminal offenses to a law enforcement agency. So what this really illustrates is that in the schools that do have these formal policies, there's still a lot of gray area. There's a lot of gray area in what the police officer is allowed to do, what they are supposed to be doing, right? What their role is. And in my opinion, it's that gray area that's really that situations that might start out as kind of a minor situation can then escalate if there's not a very clear idea of how a police officer should intervene. So this would be an interesting thing to look at for people coming from many different school districts, is to try to, this should be something that is available to the public, this MOU or IGA. It would be worthwhile to try to view the one that's written between your school and the police department, just to kind of get an idea of what it says. In districts that have really wanted to address the issue of discriminatory practices in arrests and discipline, they have taken a hard look at these, and they've rewritten them to make sure that they're equitable and how they approach student discipline. So they can be significant. One other thing I just want to add, sorry, can you go back really quick? A lot of students, have had negative experience with police officers. That might be something, they maybe have seen someone in their family have an interaction that isn't positive. They maybe haven't had a good interaction themselves, right? So some students do feel safer with an officer in the school, but there's a large chunk of the student population that feels less safe with an officer in the building, just based on their past experience. Good.
We're going to transition now to talk about mental health in teens. There is a big push right now, nationally, state, locally, to look at the ways that we could use the resources available in a way that addresses a need that teens are asking for, teens are seeking and wanting, in a way that might be more effective at changing that behavior that we're seeking to address. So overall, we know that mental health is a topic that is near and dear to the hearts of teens, as well as those that love their teens, and preteens for that matter. Suicide rate among children ages 10 to 17 has increased by 70% in the last 10, 15 years. It is the second leading cause of death. I mentioned at the start of this presentation, I myself have lost two young friends to suicide. About 72%, so over 2/3, almost 3/4 of children in the US will have experienced one traumatic event. This, unfortunately, is going to be disproportionately seen in children of color as well, because of some of the inherent trauma that comes with, say, incarceration of a parent, removal of family, as well as other things. So that we could spend a whole lot of time unpacking as well. But that traumatic event is more common than not. Now, I am not an expert in this field. I know I got a working functional knowledge, right? But something that I have that's really stuck with me from experts is that when we look at applying and assessing trauma and whatnot, unless you are trained and you are there to specifically treat that trauma, it is best to use a universal approach. And this number specifically really speaks to why. Universal meaning we don't necessarily need to walk around and try to figure out who's showing signs of trauma, but treating everybody in a way that is trauma informed. And by that, you could spend a lot of time training on that, but compassionate, kind, understanding, very far from punitive, in fact. So 1 in 5 youth will develop mental health difficulties that will eventually warrant a diagnosis. Mental health challenges are underdiagnosed, so you could argue that this number is likely higher anyway. Students, when they do have access to a school health-based center, my mother actually runs one of these in Bangor, and I'm proud of that because it increases the likelihood that the student will visit. They are 21 more times likely to visit a school-based health center than a community health center in their own community. Part of this is accessibility, part of this is relationships, but we know that that figure exists there. School mental health workers, that could be counselors, nurses, social workers, psychologists is how we're defining it for the purpose of this. They're frequently the first to notice when a kid is off, when something's wrong there. They have that window and they have that trust. And data does show that school staff who provide mental health services not only improve the health outcome, so we'd expect a mental health outcome improvement from mental health workers, right? But we also see improved school safety. Our restorative practices data reflects that as well. When students have a positive conflict resolution experience, 9 out of 10 of those students are indicating they feel more engaged and safer in their classroom environment following that process.
This information is taken from an ACLU report called Cops and No Counselors. It's an excellent report. You can get it online. You can read a summary of it, or you can download the whole thing. But it studied the ratios between, counselors, psychologists, social workers, and nurses, and what the recommended ratio is, and then state by state, you can look at what the actual ratio is in that state. So you can see, for example, that counselors, the recommended ratio is 250 students to every 1 counselor. In Michigan, that number is 693 to 1. So that's the kind of average across the state of Michigan. Social workers is also 250 to 1 ratio recommended. In Michigan, it's 1,051 to 1. School psychologists recommended 700 to 1. And in Michigan, we have 2,184 school psychologists for every 1 student. And finally, nurses, the ratio recommended is 750 to 1. And in Michigan, you can see that we're way off, 4,000 199 to 1. So these numbers are very shocking, right? They really are. They really illustrate this desperate need we have in this country to find that funding and increase the number of support staff in especially these 4 areas in our schools. And that would be a tremendous help for our students who are struggling, students with disabilities, students with mental health issues, students who have experienced a lot of trauma. This could be, you know, directing our federal funding to this rather than more police officers could help our students a lot. And just to kind of, since we're talking about that funding issue, right? If you look at funding over the past 3 decades, in 23 states, the increased per capita spending on corrections was more than double the rate of the increased funding for education, right? And Michigan is one of 7 states that increased their corrections budget more than 5 times as fast as their funding for preschool through 12 education. So that is, you know, that shows you as a state where we have put our money. We've put our money into the incarceration system, much higher rate than into our schools.
This next slide is a visual of what to expect when we're talking with teenagers. Teenagers are amazing in a lot of different ways, and because they can speak and in some ways act like adults, we forget that developmentally they are not. So if you look at, for example, the red area, the prefrontal cortex, this is responsible for reasoning, for planning, for making responsible decisions. And this doesn't develop until about 25 years of age. So we set these high expectations, and we are not here to advocate letting kids off the hook. We are not here to advocate for lowering our expectations for what we want to see. What we are advocating for is higher support and higher understanding. So if you're thinking that a teenager or a preteen for that matter is acting more impulsively, immaturely, engaging in risky behavior, being more excited about the reward and less focused on what the consequence might be. If you're repeating yourself over and over again, then you are seeing a teenager act exactly how a teenager's brain is telling them to act. So it is not a scientifically sound or reasonable expectation on our end to ask our young people, our teenagers specifically, to behave as we do as fully grown adults. And I say this as gently as possible, but as adults, we don't always behave that well, right? We don't always think about the consequences more than we think about the reward. We don't always plan out things as maturely and responsibly as possible. So we sometimes hold our kids and our teenagers to an even higher level of standard than we're actually holding ourselves or our adult peers. Now, again, I mentioned trauma throughout this presentation. Molly and I both talked about this. We could spend a whole lot of time talking about this as well, trauma-informed care and the information that's come out of these studies. This really stemmed from a study done now decades ago on, it started as a wellness study actually. So the ACE study, the Adverse Childhood Experiences, and I remember, I always tell this story, but I remember my mom presenting me this like stack of research being, you know, in middle school or something. I'm looking at this paper, like, what do you want me to do with this? But she was so excited because she'd worked with families and in the mental health setting and children for years. And it was like this tangible proof that what she had experienced as a counselor for years with people is that people who have had hardships in life, they are set up to have a harder life in some ways. Now, the positive that we know, because it is not all doom and gloom, is that when treated in some trauma-informed ways, that some of the best, strongest people have experienced some really hard things and become more resilient because of it. So what you will experience, let's say someone is having a trauma response, is what's called like a flipped lid. And you could look at the brain, you know, if the hand is the brain stem, or the brain, if you will, we've got brain stem down here and beginning development. So a lot of still emotional firing here as well. And then executive functioning, that prefrontal cortex. So when you say that flipped lid, this area of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, the decision making really isn't engaged. We're not thinking from there. As people age, we start to wrap around and we see more of those logical thought processes. Again, think scientifically sound explanation for behavior versus what we think they should or shouldn't be doing. And the brain just in general develops differently when we've experienced trauma. So this is why you see a student maybe throw a chair because someone tossed a pencil at them, and we think of the shoulds and the woulds and well I would, but really there is potentially a trauma response occurring. We're not saying that that issue doesn't need to be addressed or that it's okay or that we're condoning it, but again, seeking to understand a root cause and a better way to approach it can be really, really impactful. So some of the important features of trauma-informed care, and highly encourage you to get formally trained on this as well, or at least seek out more information, is having a safe environment, which, as you see from the diagram, can include predictability, space, among other things. Building connection, so that's one of the key indicators for resiliency and success of teens and young people who have experienced trauma, is having had that person who stuck with them. So stick it out for the kids in your life that you love, even if they are challenging at times. And supporting, teaching, and modeling emotional regulation. So if you are yelling at the top of your lungs, I said stop yelling, what that's modeling to your kids, whether your own kids or your kids in your classroom, is that it is actually okay to yell and to be mean when you're upset. So support and teach, and importantly, model that emotional regulation.
So coming to the end of our presentation, we wanted a chance to just share a little bit about restorative practices. Restorative practices is one way forward. It is not intended to be just kind of used independently. We advocate for more support for students in all areas, right? Better mental health supports, positive behavior support, other kinds of practices that don't push students out, but find ways to keep them in the building and work with them on misbehavior. But restorative practices is one very important way that we can start changing our schools to make them more restorative, more inclusive. So the fundamental premise of restorative practices is that people are happier, more cooperative and productive, and more likely to make positive changes when those in authority do things with them rather than to them or for them. So that word to them, right, that's the punitive stuff that we're talking about. When authority figures do things to kids, that means they're, punishing them. When people do things for kids, that means we're letting them off the hook, and we might be providing support, but we're not, limit setting for them or putting any controls in place. So restorative practices advocates for people, especially in authority, doing things with students, right? To engage with them, you engage with them, hold them accountable, talk about their behavior, why they acted the way they did, who they harmed, who was impacted by their behavior, right? And have a conversation and figure out a way forward that doesn't involve just pushing them out of school. So that's the idea behind restorative practices, is that we're engaging with students, still holding them accountable, but finding a way forward and possibly having them come up with, this is what I think I need to do in order to repair the harm that was done. So restorative approach includes everyone in a school building, teachers, administrators, students, support staff. It includes everyone. And imagine this triangle as our whole school community. We have the base of our triangle. That includes everyone, right? So there are practices, restorative practices that can be used across the board for all students, all staff. We're working on building that social emotional capacity. We're working on strengthening relationships across the board, building a stronger school community and school climate, teaching and modeling healthy communication skills. So all of these things can be done like in a school building, and this has been done. Schools have adopted this across, a whole school district successfully, and they've really flipped their school culture and climate, right? That's one of the first steps that we're going for, is to create a positive climate. Students feel safer, they feel more welcome, they're in a better place to learn when our school climates are positive and healthy. And then as we go up the triangle, we are going to run into, conflict in schools. There's going to be difficulties, disruptions, and there are then tools in place, restorative dialogue, circles, peer mediation, that can address those as they come up. And finally, for a smaller number of students and staff, there is going to be a more serious conflict that might happen. And there are tools under, this restorative practice umbrella that can be used to help students sit down together and talk out something that happened, or help a teacher and a student sit down together and talk about what happened and what needs to happen to move forward. So this approach includes the whole school building. When it's done right, this is how it's imagined. So we're gonna just take a look at this imaginary scenario. This young man named Carlos and his walk through two different schools. One school that operates under a zero tolerance education system, and then the green, the right side, is a walk through a restorative practices based education system. This is just going to kind of highlight some of the little small decisions that have huge impacts on a student's life. So at the very top it says, Carlos had a heated argument with his parents before leaving for school, so he's running late. And we're going to see the difference between zero tolerance and restorative practices. So he arrives at school. We're going to follow the zero tolerance one first. He is greeted by metal detectors and a police search. He's late to his first period class. His teacher scolds him in front of the class. Carlos talks back and is given a detention. He gets into a minor altercation in the cafeteria. A school police officer detains and arrests both students, and then later that afternoon, he's being held in a juvenile detention facility. He's missing school. Now he has something on his record, and he is also facing suspension. While this is a hypothetical situation, this is real. This kind of stuff does happen in our schools, and this is exactly what we're talking about when we refer to this school to prison pipeline. Students, get pushed out, they get entered into the juvenile justice system, and then from there, sometimes that leads them on a downhill path to prison. So let's take a walk on the other side. He arrives at school. Teachers and administrators welcome him and his fellow students as they enter. He's late to his first period class. His teachers wait until after class to speak with Carlos to learn more, and sets up a meeting with his school counselor. He gets into a minor altercation in the cafeteria. Student peer mediators and support staff intervene, have the students sit down together and de-escalate the situation. And later that afternoon, Carlos and the other student agree to help clean the cafeteria during a free period, and he meets with his counselor and parents after school to help resolve the conflict at home, right? So many supports going on there, right? In most schools, those supports would not be as available as they are to Carlos under this hypothetical situation. The other thing I just want to point out is that every step of the way, I talked about that the whole point of restorative is to engage with students. So every step of that way, they're engaging with him, right? They're finding out his perspective, his story, what's going on at home, what do you need to, so that we can help you. How can we resolve this conflict, right? So they're engaging with him every single step of the way. So it really highlights the difference that a restorative approach can take.
So that a school can take on. So where do we go from here? In addition to restorative practices and focusing on students taking responsibility for the consequences and the resolution of that, which often we don't speak about with discipline, but this also addresses the need of the person who was harmed by that action. So that's something to consider about restorative practices as well, as it's not just the needs of the students, say with the disruptive behavior and all of that. It's also the students and other people in the building that might be harmed by that behavior as well that want to say in that. And that's one of the big draws of restorative practices. Professional development. So we all can't get enough education, right? But on classroom management, psychology and cultural agility, conflict resolution skills. And it's really important, if possible, and I know this a lot of times comes down to contracts and the pragmatic pieces of employment, right? But really having all members of that school community trained in some of these things, because often in the lunchroom, you may not have the highly trained master's degree teaching professional. You may have the wonderful cafeteria worker who maybe just needs some more training in some of these areas to navigate a lunchroom conflict. Social and emotional learning should be integrated into the curriculum. So not just a 5-minute once in a while thing, but inherently built into the very educational curriculum that we're using. Even as adults, there's projected to be a deficit of skilled workers in the areas of these social and emotional skills. These, we like to call them soft skills, but these just essential skill sets for adults and children alike. So why not teach that in their educational environment? Having high quality alternative educational settings, both in where a student might go if they do need to be removed from their school environment, and also in-house alternatives as well. Having social, mental health, psychological services to address the varying student needs that occur. We know that mental health struggles, as we talked about, very real, very prevalent in that population, in our teen and young adult population. Explicit and dedicated mindfulness time. So there is a lot of science behind deep breathing and mindfulness. So even if it seems out there, even if you don't believe in doing meditation or that it doesn't work, if you sit and you meditate and you breathe and you practice those deep belly breaths, it actually doesn't matter if you think it works, because your body is designed to say, it stimulates the vagus nerve and it helps us relax. It tells our body, our parasympathetic nervous system, to kick in, say things are okay. So teaching this to our young people is really, really powerful, as well as for us as well. And then for all educators, for all people, all parents out there, prioritize your self-care. Say that again, prioritize your self-care. If you are not regulated, if you are not well, if your cup has been empty and it's been empty for a long time, we are not going to be able to model, teach that regulation that we are, again, then asking of our young people to do. So again, prioritize your self-care, because it does impact your performance as a parent, as a teacher, as a professional in general. Overall, there's lots of different components that can work together to instead create a school to peace pipeline. So inclusivity, social emotional learning, restorative justice, equity, classroom strategies, and mindfulness. So we are not advocating that this is a quick switch. If anything, we have a very long uphill road ahead of us, but we are very much advocating that we all walk together and start this now. And much of this work has already begun, but we must continue forward on it. So just wanted to thank you for joining us. If you'd like to get a hold of us, you can find Molly and Mai's information on the Gryphon Place website. Again, thank you for your time, and Molly, I'll pass it over to you.
Yeah, I think, once again, thank you. I think we're gonna just go ahead and have some time for Q&A at this point. So will anybody have any questions? We can answer those right now. Yep. So how did you get into working in restorative justice? Gryphon Place has actually had a presence in schools doing this type of work for a number of years. I couldn't even tell you exactly how long, but it's a chunk of time. So they you know, they do other work as well. They're most well known for their crisis line and their 211 helpline. But this has been a part of the work at Gryphon Place for a good chunk of time. So I basically just got a job there, and that's how I got into this. I happened to step in when it was kind of exploding and it was being talked about all over the place, right? So it was kind of like a good time to start learning and educating myself. So.
Awesome. And I had started at Gryphon Place after losing a couple of friends actually to suicide, and I started as a youth suicide prevention education specialist, and just really liked Gryphon Place as a whole, and it's a really unique agency and all the different stuff that we do. And I kind of got a different scope on the social justice front, doing some graduate courses at Western on substance abuse, and realizing the disparities there, and the just harmful ways that justice has been applied. And so that really opened up my eyes, and kind of, once you have that spark, a fire starts ablazing, if you will. So that's kind of my story there.
Have they decriminalized marijuana crimes in Michigan since legalization?
They have.
Okay.
It's still a federal crime, so there's a little bit of subjectivity there, but it's been largely decriminalized. And we actually have like 45 weed stores in Kalamazoo now, or something. Not really, maybe 8, but so I would anticipate that we see those incarceration rates specifically for drug crimes to decrease, but that's my perspective. So.
And if other people don't have their hands up, I'm just going to keep going, but I don't want to monopolize it.
Go for it. Nicole, do you mind if there's a couple questions in the chat box. Do you mind if I address those first, and then we'll get back to as many as you got. So has KPL implemented any restorative practices in dealing with patrons, specifically teens? That would not be a question for us, but maybe Karen can speak to that. If not, Karen, you can't or don't want to, that's okay too.
I really don't know. I don't work specifically in the teen area, so I can't really respond to that myself either. I'm sorry.
No problem. Thanks for chiming in. We did send out the PowerPoint. However, if you want to send your email, whether privately or just in the main chat, we can resend it to you again, right? So that we make sure you have it. So. And I think, unless there's more in the chat box, that brings it back to you, Nicole.
Can I just jump in really quick?
Oh,
So
yeah.
one of the resources that was so helpful to us was an ACLU report called Cops and No Counselors. That's something that you can print, you know, you can find it online as a PDF. So it's called Cops and No Counselors. It's from 2019, so it's very good recent information. And that's where we got a lot of those numbers that we use in a lot of the data. So I would recommend that if people want to learn more.
That's a good point. And if you are interested in looking up we had a private question about a certain school. If you're interested in looking up the school district you work for or your kids go to, most of that information can be found if you look up civil rights data that can be searched on that website. So that's how I found that content in that particular slide. And Nicole, did you have some questions
Yeah. So my question was, what percentage of Gryphon Place trainers or that do similar jobs to yourself and Molly are from historically disenfranchised groups? And does Gryphon Place, and again, I apologize if this is, I'm not familiar with that facility. Like I said, I've been gone literally 30 years, even though I do get back there, and I know about that place in Kalamazoo that you can eat stuff where you cook it on a rock.
Oh,
That seems to be a cool place. Last time,
the first time, yep.
But I don't know about Gryphon Place. But anyway, and so and is this something that Gryphon Place, is trying to work toward having?
Yeah,
more?
absolutely. So I don't know about our agency as a whole, but I will speak to our restorative justice team. It's a small team, but half of the group, people of color and come from various backgrounds. And then our CEO is a very proud Latina woman. She runs a small group called AS, so training Latina leaders. So she's very, we could certainly work on that, because I would say the helping hands in nonprofit field in general is predominantly white and female. And I'm not knocking that because I am that, but you certainly want to have representation in the workplace, right? So if that answers your question, if not, let me know.
Yep.
Molly, if you want to jump in, feel free as well.
Nope, that was great.
I think that's great that, I mean, that half of your team is, because yeah, most people look like us. Although I suppose I'm getting into the elderly group, but did you, as a general rule, does your group, your Department of Restorative Justice, do you approach the work that's public school, well, schools in general and the educational system that we have had to this point is institutionally racist? Do you approach the work with that being, you know, in other words, if you use like, you know, critical race theory, that just, is that how you approach the work or no?
I would say I personally do. Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a lot of systemic racism in our country. We see this, this school to prison pipeline impact certainly couldn't exist in a silo. And if we think about incarceration rates, for example, we know that, you know, approximately 6 to 7 Black men will be incarcerated versus the 1 to 22 to 24 white men. We know that most of those crimes are going to be related to drug offenses, despite not higher usages among Black men. Black men are not using drugs at higher rates. So what that means for children, what that means for families is that a student with a Black father is at a higher risk for having that father not in their home because they've been incarcerated, again, despite not having higher risk for that drug use, for example. So to me, I think about this a lot. We do try to explicitly state this in what we present sometimes, but we also want to meet people where they're at. And there's a level of that as well. And Molly may have some thoughts there too.
No, I mean, I definitely come from a similar place. And like in a presentation like this one, our hope is that the data can really speak to this issue without us having to come out and say, like, yes, our schools have been a part of this institutional racism that, you know, we are now reckoning with, like that this is something that we're talking about and we're dealing with right now. And it's a conversation that needs to happen. I mean, that's why we're doing this. Honestly, it's not our area of expertise. It's just something that we feel strongly about. And we want to get this conversation going because it's not going to be an individual who can change this. It's going to take, you know, communities of people to really change this. There's so many great teachers out there who are concerned and they don't necessarily like what's going on, and administrators, but it really is going to take the much wider community to start making any real change.
I see that Sonia has a question or has her hand up.
Really just want to appreciate you guys for taking the time to do this and recommend push out, because I was able to see the screening before it went. I work at a school, but I work through a nonprofit organization, Kent School Services Network. And what we do is we push for equitable, but what we're seeing is I'm glad that you talked about the adolescent brain, but it also is the language that some of the teachers are utilizing when kids have misbehaviors, right? Mm-hmm. So I think we need to be mindful as a village when we start to label these small children who are in 3rd grade aggressive, non-compliant, naughties. I mean, those words stick and they hurt and they stay for life. So that's why when you see like them become famous people, you know, they will remember what you say and they will remember those who really poured into them and thank you when you do pour into them. So I think, you know, I've heard, we're addressing this, right, because of the state of our nation right now. And we're addressing this as a school, but systems have to change, but we have to also push for the change. We have to be part of the change. And that means having difficult conversations, but remember that they're children. And them not having some father presence was intentionally done to the family. The fabric of the Black family has been destroyed intentionally with what we have now legalized, low drug crimes, right? So now it's okay for everybody to buy it. So let's overturn all those convictions and bring those fathers home. So I think we have to accept accountability for implicit biases and what we bring to the table. But I am so appreciative that I was able to catch wind of this and just be a part of this. I appreciate what you're doing. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for lifting those things up, Sonia.
Yeah, thank you. I honestly, it's like all right here. And if we had 2 hours, that right in and of itself, our implicit bias and how that plays a role in suspensions, right? That absolutely plays a role. And
Yes.
it's a whole nother thing we could spend, you know, the next hour talking about. So thank you for raising that.
I don't think I lifted this statistic up, but on average, a white student is more likely to get suspended for something objective, so like theft or destruction of property. A Black student is more likely to get it suspended for a subjective offense, so insubordination or being disrespectful. So there's plenty of work to be done there, and it is done right here first. It is not those folks out there. We all have to look at that internally, folks, and some of that too, right? But thank you for lifting that up, Sonia.
I wanted to say something right quick.
Go right ahead, Molly.
I can't get my video to come on, but anyway, thank you all. This has been awesome. But I just wanted to throw something in that I was thinking about. You know, people talk about the Push Out movie, which I was a part of the conversation and the movie when it first came out. And they talk about Black males of color, and they forget also that not only are they criminalized and arrested, but they're also assaulted and treated harshly, you know, by officers in the school. Just because as a race, we're taller, our bone structure is different, and the society has labeled people as a threat, you know, just by how they look, just by their size. And there's no way they could do anything about that. But even the girls, they'll take them and they'll treat them like they're some men. And they are children, just as you said. So I want to throw that in there too, because Kalamazoo is dealing with that conversation too, trying to just get officers to see that they are children, they are youth, they are not grown. They may be 6 feet, 7 feet tall, but their brain hasn't developed and they haven't got there yet. So thank you for this conversation.
Thank you, Molly. And we are lucky enough to have Molly on our team at Gryphon Place too. So Molly's been a great source of expertise through us. And yeah, Molly's awesome. If you don't know her, she's great. Double Molly's greatness over here. Nicole, did you have, I think that was only maybe two or three over there.
Okay, so Molly, I'll go with my questions out of order. Is ACAB, is that a dialogue that people talk about back there? Are people, which is all cops are, the social movement, all cops are, I'm not gonna finish it because I'm not supposed to swear in front of my elders. All cops are, it's called ACAB.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with that.
All cops are, and it's a bad word for a guy. Okay. Right? So the ACAB movement is, you know, to defund police. I just wondered if it was a thing in Michigan, if you guys talked about it, if it was, doesn't seem like you guys are talking. Okay. All right. Next. I just want to get through these because I don't want you guys to be here forever. And just wanted you to know, a lot of my work that I did in my doctorate is around social justice and so forth. And if you look at, because I know that you said, you know, the data points or whatever, just want to put on your radar, if you guys look at a lot of the qualitative studies in critical race theory, you're going to find a lot of good meaty things here when you talked about not being able to match the two. So you might want to check it out. That was
sure, thank you.
Question. Yep.
We had found different numbers amongst ourselves.
Yeah.
Some reports it, right?
Right, and some of the qualitative studies around critical race theory are quite large studies, right? And so it's not something just, you know, anecdotal that's a one-off kind of thing. So anyway, just to put that on your radar. And our officers in Michigan that are in schools, are they not school district employees?
They are not. So in Kalamazoo, there are at least 2 officers that I know of are 2 schools that utilize them at 2 of the 2 high schools basically. And even though those high schools are in the same district, they contract with different police jurisdictions. So they are not
They
school
don't go
employees.
to a separate police academy just for school police. They would go to
They go to that police academy.
right. So they don't even have training. They have training for people who are bank robbers, for example. They don't have,
So
they don't have training.
my understanding is that there is some training that they do go through before they work in the high school, but I also would probably want to see what that looks like, and I would very easily make the argument that it's not enough, because you do need to have a lot of training when you're working with teenagers, right? It's a totally different thing. So we were talking about this with the officer at Lloyd Norris. We've been having this conversation with him. So hopefully we'll get more information on this soon.
Yeah.
Yeah, our police force out here is over 300, and they have a special, we're the 5th largest school district in the country, so it's
Oh, wow.
it's a little different, but and they go specifically to an academy that is for school. I'm not saying that that makes them great people, but I'm just saying it's a little different. And because I was confused when you're talking about the MOUs, because I was like, oh yeah, that's all negotiated, with the union and the school district or whatever. So that was my confusion. Okay. And then I also wanted to say that when you talked about the police violence, I just want to say that although police are not gunning down students in school, but because they get such a poor perception, oftentimes they may be reluctant to ask for help, or they may be resistive to those kind of things. And I don't know that we'll ever be able to draw that correlation between a poor experience in, say, 7th grade with a school police officer, and I didn't call when I had a domestic violence situation and something really bad happened, because it's too causal, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I certainly think as human beings, we're smart enough to know that probably happens. You're
Yeah,
scared, so,
yeah.
and that's it. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Taking that extra time, Ruth and Molly, that I'm
Yeah.
sure that was very helpful. Are there any other questions? It is 7:45. If not, I want to thank you again for this presentation. And if you guys want to stay on for a second, we can figure out, well, I'll just be in touch with you about the recording, the sort of spliced recording, and I'll get that to you. And I'm glad that you were able to send your PowerPoint out ahead of time, and to those people that didn't get it, I know that you'll get it to them with the email addresses.
Yes, we will. Thank you all very much. Appreciate your time and your energy.
Thank you.
Yeah,
We're
thank
okay
you,
as long as
everyone.
we're okay to share with others, as long as we give you credit, obviously, and don't take your name off and put ours.
Yeah.
We're not too worried about that, Nicole, but yeah, sure, pass along whatever you like, and thank you all. Please feel free to reach out to us. We're not hard to find. We're on the Gryphon Place website, so we're around if you need more support. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Take care.